A film that won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, was shot without a finished script. The lead actor considered walking off the production entirely. One of its most beloved actors never lived to see it released. For more than 2 decades, Russell Crowe has been dropping pieces of what actually happened behind the scenes, one interview at a time, gradually filling in a picture most audiences at the time never suspected existed behind the finished film. Long after the film itself had already been enshrined as one of the defining epics of its era, quoted, parodied, and studied by an entire generation of filmmakers who grew up watching it. Here is Russell Crowe finally revealing what he hid about Gladiator. The script he called rubbish. Gladiator arrived in theaters in May 2000, looking like the product of careful, deliberate planning. A sweeping historical epic with a clear vision from beginning to end. The kind of film that critics and audiences alike assumed had been meticulously mapped out long before the cameras ever started rolling. According to Russell Crowe's own account, that could not have been further from the truth. Speaking with Vanity Fair in 2023, more than 2 decades after the film's release, Crowe described the state of the screenplay when production began in blunt terms, calling it rubbish, adding the qualifier absolute rubbish for emphasis, and noting it was filled with strange, disconnected sequences that made little sense as a coherent story from beginning to end. Crowe specifically recalled scenes in that early draft involving gladiators riding chariots branded with advertisements for products like olive oil, a detail so tonally bizarre that he cited it directly as evidence of just how far the screenplay still had to go before it resembled anything close to the finished film. A strange enough image that it has continued to resurface in interviews and retrospectives as shorthand for exactly how far the original material had strayed from the tone the finished movie eventually achieved. Crowe has said in multiple interviews since that he and director Ridley Scott only agreed on roughly 21 pages of usable material out of a script that should have run well over 100. A gap so significant that it would have alarmed almost any studio executive who fully understood the scale of it at the time, and one that Crowe has said still strikes him as almost unbelievable in hindsight, given the scope and budget of the production that was nonetheless allowed to move forward under those conditions. Screenwriter David Franzone's original draft had already gone through significant revision by John Logan before filming began, and a third writer, William Nicholson, was brought in during production itself to keep pace with the growing gap between what had been written and what the production actually needed day to day. Crowe has described the process bluntly, explaining that the production had essentially used up its usable material by the time filming reached its second major location in Morocco, meaning the crew was writing and rewriting scenes on a near-daily basis just to stay ahead of the shooting schedule, an arrangement that placed enormous pressure not just on the writers, but on Crowe and his fellow actors, who often received new pages only hours before they were expected to perform them on camera. Crowe later told the BBC that shooting a film of that scale without a finished script was, in his words, the dumbest possible way to make a film, a verdict he has repeated in various forms across nearly every interview where the subject has come up since. That confession about the state of the script was only the beginning of what Crowe has gradually revealed about a production that very nearly fell apart before it ever reached theaters. The General almost had a different name entirely. Long before Russell Crowe stepped onto set as Maximus Decimus Meridius, the character existed under a completely different identity, one that few fans of the finished film would ever recognize today. Early drafts of the screenplay, developed under David Franzone before Ridley Scott had even signed on to direct, referred to the central character as Narcissus, a name drawn loosely from Roman history, but one that carried none of the weight or gravity the filmmakers eventually wanted for their protagonist. Franzone's initial research drew partly from Daniel P. Mannix's 1958 book Those About to Die, which explored the brutal realities of the Roman gladiatorial games, giving the project its earliest historical foundation well before any studio or director had formally attached themselves to it. As the project moved through further rounds of rewriting, the character was renamed and reshaped substantially, evolving into the loyal Roman general whose betrayal and quest for vengeance would define the finished film. A transformation that took place gradually across multiple drafts rather than through any single decisive rewrite. The shift extended beyond the name itself, touching major elements of the character's backstory and motivation as successive writers worked to sharpen what had originally been a much less focused figure, gradually building toward the specific combination of grief, duty, and vengeance that would eventually define Maximus on screen. By the time Crowe was cast, the character had already been rebuilt several times over, a detail that helps explain why so much of the role still felt unfinished and open to interpretation once cameras actually started rolling, leaving considerable room for both Crowe and Scott to keep shaping the character even after filming had already begun. That same sense of an unfinished character extended directly into how much creative control Crowe himself was allowed, or in some accounts, took, once filming was already underway, a question that has never been fully settled even decades after the film's release. Just how much did Crowe actually rewrite? For years, a persistent story circulated that Russell Crowe had essentially become an uncredited co-writer on Gladiator, rewriting scenes on the spot to compensate for the unfinished script he had already gone on record criticizing, a story that grew more elaborate with each retelling across 2 decades of press coverage. An unnamed DreamWorks executive told Time magazine during the film's original promotional run that Crowe had tried to rewrite the entire script on the spot, and that account, combined with Crowe's own comments over the years about specific lines and scenes he claimed credit for, hardened into something close to Hollywood legend, repeated so often in profiles and retrospectives that many fans came to accept it as settled fact rather than one contested version of events among several. Producer Douglas Wick pushed back directly on that narrative in later interviews, stating plainly that Crowe's contributions to the screenplay had been greatly exaggerated over time. According to Wick, the finished script remained fundamentally the product of Franzoni, Logan, and Nicholson, even accounting for the genuine improvisation that happened on set during filming. And he suggested that Crowe's own retellings over the years, combined with the DreamWorks executive's comments to Time, had allowed a somewhat inflated version of Crowe's authorship to take on a life of its own, circulating for years as accepted fact rather than one contested account among several competing versions of events. That same DreamWorks executive who spoke to Time also described Crowe as not well behaved during production, noting that the actor would frequently get into physical altercations with local villagers while filming in Morocco, behavior some on set attributed to Crowe's method of working himself into the mindset of a hardened Roman soldier rather than any genuine hostility toward the people around him, though the executive's blunt characterization suggests at least some genuine friction existed between Crowe and portions of the crew during that stretch of the shoot. Whatever the exact truth about how many lines Crowe personally wrote, one specific piece of dialogue has a well-documented origin story that Crowe himself has confirmed in detail, and it traces back to his own childhood, where strength and honor actually came from. Among Gladiator's most quoted lines is the simple exchange between Maximus and his soldiers before battle, delivered as strength and honor. According to Crowe's own account, given during an appearance on The Graham Norton Show, the phrase did not originate with any of the film's credited screenwriters at all. It came from his old-school motto, carried forward from a chapter of his life that had nothing to do with acting or ancient Rome. Crowe has explained that his school's actual motto was a Latin phrase translating to truth and virtue, and that he approached Ridley Scott during preparation wanting his character to have a similar kind of ritual phrase, something soldiers could exchange as both greeting and rallying cry, a small piece of shared identity between Maximus and the men serving under him, drawn directly from Crowe's own memories of reciting the phrase during his school years. Crowe has said he suggested a Latin phrase to Scott directly, something closer to Forza e Honorum, and when Scott asked what it meant, Crowe translated it as strength and honor. According to Crowe, Scott's response was immediate, telling him simply to use that line in the film without any further debate or revision needed. The phrase went on to become one of the most recognizable pieces of dialogue in the entire movie, repeated by fans and referenced constantly in the decades since, printed on merchandise, quoted in tributes, and cited by other filmmakers as a shorthand example of how a single simple line can end up carrying an entire film's emotional identity, all traced back to a boarding school motto Crowe had carried with him since childhood. Not every piece of improvisation on set was quite so calculated. One of the film's most emotional scenes came together through a much less deliberate process, and it produced one of the more unexpectedly funny stories Crowe has told about working with Scott. the scene that needed less snot. During the filming of Maximus's grief-stricken reaction to a pivotal moment involving Marcus Aurelius, Crowe committed fully to the emotional weight of the scene, delivering a take so raw and physically overwhelmed that it went noticeably further than anyone on set had anticipated. Crowe has described losing himself completely in the moment, producing a level of visible, audible emotional release that surprised even him once the cameras stopped rolling, describing the sensation afterward as having genuinely lost track of where the performance ended and his own reaction began. Ridley Scott's response, according to Crowe's own retelling of the story and later interviews, was to call cut, walk over, and deliver a note that has since become one of the more frequently repeated anecdotes from the production, just a little less snot. The blunt, almost comedic feedback in the middle of such a heavy emotional scene has become one of Crowe's favorite stories to tell about his working relationship with Scott, illustrating a dynamic between actor and director built on trust, substantial enough to survive even the most awkward possible note delivered at the most vulnerable possible moment. Crowe has said in interviews that the note, rather than embarrassing him, actually captured something essential about how the two of them worked together throughout the production, treating even the most emotionally demanding scenes with a level of practical, unpretentious honesty that kept the set from ever feeling overly precious about its own material. A dynamic Crowe has credited with helping him stay grounded through some of the film's heavier emotional stretches rather than getting lost in his own performance. That same spirit of trust and last-minute improvisation defined one of the film's most quietly devastating monologues, one whose true authorship has become a subject of some dispute even among the people who were there. The speech about home. One of the film's most quoted passages involves Maximus describing his farm to Marcus Aurelius, a monologue built around the specific sensory image of soil, the color of his wife's hair. Multiple accounts from the film's original promotional period, including reporting in Entertainment Weekly at the time, credited the speech's most personal details directly to Crowe, suggesting he drew the imagery from thoughts of his own home and the woman he was involved with during that period of his life, turning what could have been a generic piece of exposition into something considerably more intimate and specific. That version of events became part of the film's broader promotional mythology for years, cited in academic essays about the film and repeated in countless retrospectives, including at least one scholarly piece specifically examining Gladiator's connection to contemporary American culture that treated Crowe's authorship of the speech as an established fact rather than a disputed claim. Producer Douglas Wick's later pushback on Crowe's overall script contributions has cast some doubt on exactly how much of that specific speech Crowe personally originated versus refined from material the writers had already drafted. Though Crowe has never publicly disputed his own connection to the monologue's most personal imagery, and no writer credited on the film has stepped forward to specifically claim that particular passage as their own either. Whatever its exact authorship, the scene remains one of the moments fans and critics most frequently cite when discussing why Gladiator's screenplay problems never fully undermined the finished film's emotional impact. A rare case where a chaotic writing process apparently produced one of the film's most carefully observed pieces of character work rather than one of its weaker patched-together scenes, and one that continues to appear in lists of the most memorable monologues in modern historical filmmaking more than 2 decades after the film's original release. None of the improvisation, script disputes, or on-set tension compares to the single event that came closest to derailing the production entirely. A tragedy that occurred not on camera, but in a small bar during a break from filming. The death that changed the ending. On May 2nd, 1999, actor Oliver Reed, who played the Gladiator trainer Proximo, spent an afternoon off from filming at a pub in Valletta, Malta, where production had relocated for several months of the shoot after principal photography began earlier that year. Reed, who had a long, well-documented history with alcohol dating back decades before Gladiator, had reportedly promised Ridley Scott he would refrain from drinking during the production, though he had continued visiting bars on weekends between shooting days throughout the shoot, a habit that had already become something of an open secret among those working closely with him. On this particular afternoon, he spent an extended session drinking heavily alongside a group of British Royal Navy sailors who were on shore leave from a nearby ship. He collapsed later that afternoon and suffered a heart attack, dying before he could be reached by emergency responders, despite attempts by those nearby to help him. He was 61 years old, and the news of his death, arriving in the middle of an already difficult production, sent a wave of genuine shock through the cast and crew, many of whom had grown close to Reed over the preceding months of filming, despite his reputation for unpredictable behavior off-camera. Reed's death occurred with significant portions of his role still unfilmed, and his character, Proximo, played too large a part in the story's structure to simply write around entirely, leaving Scott and the production with a genuine crisis to solve in the middle of an already difficult shoot. Ridley Scott faced a decision between scrapping Reed's already filmed scenes at enormous cost or attempting something that had rarely been done successfully at that point in filmmaking history. Scott chose the latter, authorizing an effects team to digitally map Reed's face onto a body double using early computer-generated imagery technology, at a reported cost of roughly $3 million, in order to complete Proximo's remaining scenes and give the character a proper ending within the finished film, a decision that meant fundamentally altering the character's fate in the story, since Proximo had originally been written to survive the events of the film rather than die on screen, as he ultimately does in the released version. Visual effects supervisor Rob Harvey, who later won an award for the work, has described the process as unusually difficult given how limited the available technology still was at the time, requiring the team to comb through unused footage of Reed to find usable lines and expressions that could be pieced together into a coherent final sequence, a painstaking process that involved reviewing every available frame of the actor's performance in search of material that could be salvaged and reassembled into something resembling a complete scene. The technical work paid off critically as well as narratively, earning Reed a posthumous nomination for Best Supporting Actor at the following year's BAFTA Awards, alongside the film's Ensemble Screen Actors Guild nomination, a rare instance of a performance completed after an actor's death, still receiving formal industry recognition on its own merits, a fitting tribute to a role Reed had committed to fully in the months before his passing. While Reed's death represented the production's most serious real-world crisis, the film's now famous opening battle sequence carried its own set of behind-the-scenes stories, involving controlled explosions, a British forest standing in for ancient Germania, and buried equipment that most audiences watching the finished sequence would never suspect was there. A very different kind of hidden production detail from the tragedy that had unfolded in Malta. Building a battlefield in an English forest. The film's opening battle, depicting Roman legions crushing a Germanic uprising in the forests of what is now southern Germany, was actually filmed roughly 10 days in Bourne Wood, near Farnham in Surrey, England, transformed for the production into a smoke-filled, fire-lit battleground, standing in for a location thousands of miles away. Local extras who worked on the shoot have since described watching the crew bury gas canisters directly beneath the forest floor, rigged to be controlled much like an oversized gas barbecue, allowing the production to trigger bursts of flame across the battlefield on cue throughout the sequence, giving Scott precise control over exactly when and where fire would erupt across the set during each take. The scale of the production drew considerable local attention at the time, with residents recalling marquees, costumed extras dressed as Roman soldiers and Germanic warriors, and a genuine sense that a small English woodland had briefly become the center of a much larger cinematic undertaking, complete with catering tents, production vehicles, and crew members filling what was normally a quiet stretch of countryside rarely visited by anyone outside local dog walkers and hikers. Decades later, individuals who worked as extras during those 10 days have continued sharing personal memories of the shoot, including brief interactions with Crowe himself between takes, with one former extra recalling a conversation about where to find a good pub for a post-battle pint, and another describing a chance meeting with both Crowe and Scott after wandering toward the set out of simple curiosity, adding another layer of first-hand testimony to a sequence widely regarded as one of the most technically ambitious battle scenes filmed up to that point in modern cinema, still discussed locally in Surrey decades after the crew packed up and left the woods behind. 2.5 decades after that opening battle first appeared in theaters, the physical cost of building sequences like it, largely absorbed by Crowe himself rather than any stunt double, has become one of the quieter but more persistent threads running through everything he has since said about the production. Crowe wanted to come back, even as a ghost. Maximus dies at the conclusion of Gladiator, a definitive ending that seemed to close the door on any possibility of Crowe reprising the role, killed in the arena moments after finally exacting his revenge on Commodus and reuniting, in the film's closing imagery, with the family he had lost. When Gladiator 2 finally moved into production roughly 2 decades later, without Crowe attached to the sequel at all, director Ridley Scott revealed in press interviews tied to the 2024 release that Crowe had, in fact, been eager to find a way back into the story. According to Scott, speaking with People magazine, he and Crowe had actually attempted to develop a version of a sequel together as far back as roughly 18 years earlier, exploring ways to bring Maximus back into the narrative despite his death in the original film, potentially through supernatural or dreamlike sequences rather than any literal resurrection, treating the character's presence as something closer to a spiritual echo, guiding the new generation of the story rather than a straightforward continuation. That early version of a sequel never moved forward, passing through the hands of multiple writers over the years, including at one point musician Nick Cave, before the project eventually stalled entirely for the better part of 2 decades. By the time Gladiator 2 eventually reached production under a different creative direction, the story had shifted entirely toward Paul Mescal's character, Lucius, with Crowe's Maximus remaining absent from the finished film, except as a memory referenced by other characters. A choice Scott has defended publicly as the right one for the sequel's own narrative, even while acknowledging how close an earlier version of events had come to bringing Crowe back into the story directly. Scott's comments confirmed publicly, for the first time in such direct terms, just how seriously Crowe himself had wanted to find his way back to a role that had defined the most significant turning point of his entire career, even if the finished sequel ultimately told its story without him. That desire to return, more than 2 decades after Maximus first walked into the Colosseum, says as much about what the production meant to Crowe personally as any single behind-the-scenes anecdote about scripts, injuries, or improvised dialogue ever could. The physical toll nobody saw on screen. Beyond the script troubles and the tragedy involving Reed, Crowe has spoken in later interviews about the sheer physical demands the production placed on him personally, a dimension of the shoot that rarely came up in contemporary press coverage focused mostly on the film's troubled writing process rather than the toll it took on its lead actor's body. Crowe performed a significant portion of his own fight choreography and stunt work throughout the 19-week shoot, training extensively in sword work and hand-to-hand combat alongside the film's stunt coordinators before cameras ever started rolling on the arena sequences, building up the specific physical vocabulary of movement that would eventually define Maximus as a fighter on screen. Crowe has described the production's demands as relentless, particularly during the extended Colosseum sequences shot at Fort Ricasoli in Malta, where multiple days of filming often involved repeated takes of physically taxing combat choreography performed in heavy costume and armor under considerable heat, a combination that left many members of the cast and crew genuinely exhausted by the end of each shooting week, with little downtime built into a schedule already strained by the ongoing script rewrites. He has spoken about carrying real physical strain through much of the later stages of production, describing a level of exhaustion that extended well beyond what audiences would typically associate with a role built primarily around dramatic dialogue rather than continuous physical performance, noting that few viewers watching the finished film would guess just how much of the strain visible in his face during certain scenes was genuine rather than acted. That combination of an unfinished script, a demanding shooting schedule, and grueling physical requirements has led Crowe to describe the entire production on more than one occasion as one of the most genuinely difficult experiences of his career, regardless of how celebrated the finished film eventually became. A distinction he has drawn clearly between his professional pride in the result and his personal memory of how hard it actually was to make. 2 things he has said are not remotely the same and should never be confused with one another. That same physical commitment extended into one of the film's most visually striking and dangerous sequences, one involving animals that Crowe has since described sharing the frame with far more closely than most audiences would ever guess. Real tigers, real danger. For the arena sequence in which Maximus faces off against multiple tigers during a Colosseum battle, the production made the decision to use real, trained tigers, rather than relying entirely on visual effects or a more heavily controlled substitute, a choice that placed Crowe in genuinely close physical proximity to large predatory animals during filming, a decision consistent with the production's overall preference for practical, tangible effects, wherever the budget and safety considerations allowed for it. Crowe has described the experience in later interviews as considerably more nerve-wracking than most viewers would assume from watching the finished sequence, given how unpredictable large cats can be even under professional handling and careful choreography. Trainers on set worked to keep the animals as controlled as possible throughout filming, using barriers, careful blocking, and extensive rehearsal to minimize risk. But Crowe has said the tension of working that closely with animals capable of causing serious harm remained a constant undercurrent throughout the days spent filming that particular sequence, describing an awareness that no amount of professional handling could ever fully eliminate the unpredictability of a genuinely wild animal, reacting to unfamiliar noise, lighting, and movement on a busy film set, a risk he has said he tried not to think about too directly while the cameras were actually rolling. The finished scene remains one of the film's most talked about action sequences, precisely because audiences can sense, even without knowing the specific details, that something genuinely dangerous was happening just out of frame, a testament to how much of Gladiator's tension came from real, tangible risk rather than purely digital spectacle, consistent with the production's broader preference for practical effects wherever possible throughout the shoot, from the tiger sequence to the buried gas canisters in Bourne Wood to the elaborate physical Colosseum sets built at Fort Ricasoli, a commitment to practical filmmaking that has only become more apparent in hindsight, given how much modern blockbuster filmmaking has since shifted toward relying on digital environments instead. None of these individual dangers, physical or otherwise, compared to the emotional pull the role apparently still held over Crowe decades after filming had wrapped, a detail that only became public knowledge once the long-gestating sequel finally reached theaters without him. What the whole story adds up to. Taken together, the details Crowe and his collaborators have revealed over more than 2 decades paint a picture of a production that succeeded almost in spite of itself. A script Crowe openly called rubbish, a character who nearly went by an entirely different name, a director and a leading man who built some of the film's most memorable dialogue out of a boarding school motto and a moment of genuine, unplanned emotional excess. A co-star whose death forced the production to reinvent his character's ending using visual effects technology still in its relative infancy. And, decades later, a leading man who quietly hoped to find his way back into a role the film's own ending had seemingly closed off forever. Gladiator went on to gross more than $500 million worldwide and swept the Academy Awards the following year, winning 5 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Actor for Crowe himself, along with additional wins for costume design, visual effects, and sound, a haul that placed it among the most decorated films of its entire decade. None of that success was guaranteed during the 19 weeks of production that produced it, a fact Crowe has become increasingly comfortable admitting the further removed he gets from the film that first made him a household name and, according to Crowe's own account, changed the entire trajectory of his career. Crowe has said in more recent interviews that he still considers the legs the film has had over the past quarter century nothing short of remarkable, especially given how uncertain everyone involved genuinely felt about the project while they were still in the middle of making it, adding that very few people on set at the time would have predicted the film going on to define an entire era of historical filmmaking the way it eventually did. 25 years later, the gap between how chaotic the production actually was and how polished the finished film appears remains one of the more remarkable examples in modern filmmaking of a crew simply willing itself through disaster into something genuinely great, a story that has only become fuller and more textured with each new interview Crowe has given about it, and one that continues to add new detail every time a journalist thinks to ask him about it again. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.